Night and Changeling, Chapter 29, Beginning. Jen was having a nightmare. It was one she'd had before, and she found it odd that because of that, it was more comforting than the others she'd had recently. But still, the feeling of malware ripping her apart was not a pleasant one, and she was almost happy to start awake at a loud crash ripping through the silence of the night. She rolled out of bed, crashing to the floor, her dagger, which lived under her pillow, while she slept in her hand. But blinking, she found that there was no threat, or at least the threat had managed to incapacitate herself. Albeda was laying on her floor, her feet tangled in a pair of discarded jeans. Her whole head was covered in something. Jen had no idea what it was, but it was slimy and several different neon colors. Given the human Galvin's twitching and frightened moans, it couldn't be anything good. There was a knock at her door. She slipped her dagger under her pillow as her mother stuck her head into the room and raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay? What happened?" Jen shook her head. "Not entirely sure. Can you call Gwen, please? I need to call this in." Her mother nodded, frowning at the figure in the fetal position on her floor. Jen picked up her communicator from the bedside table and flicked it on. "Plumber Base, this is Gen 10. She only had to wait a beat before someone answered. "Hey, Jen, it's late. Why are you calling in?" "Hey, Cooper, I need prisoner transport and possibly a medical team to my house. ASAP, please." "What happened?" Jen shook her head. I'm not entirely sure, but I've got Albeda of the Galvin on my floor. I think she's unconscious. She's got a thing on her head. I have no idea what it is." Her door crashed open, Kevin and Gwen in the doorway, both slightly disheveled. Gwen was wearing Kevin's regular black t-shirt, while he wore only his pants and undershirt. "I'm gonna call you back, Cooper, but send the transport, please." "You got it." They clicked off the call as Gwen and Kevin noticed the figure on the floor. Jen was holding back laughter as she looked over her teammates. "What's happening?" Gwen asked, looking down at the human Galvin on the floor. "Not sure. Woke up to this," she said, pointing at the figure on the floor. "Any idea what that is?" she asked, pointing at the thing still covering Albeda's face.
"Cassiopean Dream Eater. Nasty little boogers. They trap you in a nightmare and feed off the chemicals your brain puts out when you're afraid,"
Kevin said, poking the whimpering girl in the shoulder. "Get off me," she muttered. "Can we pull it off?" Jen asked.
"Not unless we want to pull off her face with it. A Galvin doctor might be able to, though."
Jen nodded. "Transport's already on the way. You think she meant it for me?" Gwen nodded. "Can't believe that she'd have brought it for any other reason. She just didn't expect your room to be as messy as it is." Jen laughed. "I didn't expect you to show up in Kevin's shirt with a bunch of hickeys, but the unexpected can be fun sometimes." Both of them went bright red. "So were you two in the middle of something? 'Cause if so, sorry for interrupting." Both girls broke into giggles as someone knocked on the door. Kevin backed out of the room and came back with the team. They picked up the prone Albeda and nodded to them, taking her back to the base. Jen flopped back onto her bed, sighing loudly. "Can I just get one night of actual sleep?" Gwen shook her head. "Probably not. We're gonna head out. Try to get some sleep, Jen." Jen nodded into her pillow. "You two behave. Don't do anything I wouldn't do." Kevin laughed.
"You spent 3 days with Charmcaster. I'm pretty sure the list of things you wouldn't do is short as hell,"
Kevin said, laughing. Gwen punched him in the shoulder. He laughed again as they made their way out of the room. Jen managed to sleep in quite a bit for once in her life. She did feel quite a bit nervous, but the day passed by easily. Kevin kept working on his car, still determined to make it submersible. Gwen was finishing up her last class, and they were all planning on going out to the pier that night. But, of course, their plan was snatched out from under them by an ambush from the Esoterica. They managed to get them taken care of, all but one, whom they interrogated. The esoterica were moving on the seal. Jen stepped outside and pulled out her phone. She dialed up George, stepping away from Gwen. George, it's time. I'm going to see if I can't find out what the esoterica are going after. You need to mobilize your troops. Very well. Contact me as soon as you know anything. Jen nodded. Stay safe. Expect ambushes. We already got ambushed once. Stay well, my friend. Jen nodded and hung up the phone. Kevin and Gwen stepped out of the garage. All right, let's head out. We'll head to the Flamekeeper Circle's headquarters, see if we can't find out where they're going precisely. The two of them nodded and sprinted to Kevin's car. Chapter 30, On the Battlefield. They reached the battle a little late. The war was already in full swing, Forever Knights clashing with Esoterica. The knights seemed to have been expecting them. Kevin landed the rust bucket as close to the cavern holding the seal as he could. Jen turned to Gwen. Stay in the rust bucket. Gwen shook her head. No way! I'm not letting you go to war with just Kevin for backup. You'll need both of us. Kevin nodded.
She's right. We don't know what might be waiting for us there. You'll need us. Both of us.
Jen shook her head. We still don't know if the Dagon can control you anymore or not. Internally, Jen was hoping their short brush with death in Ledger Domain had at least freed her cousin from that, but there was no way to tell. Jen took off down the ramp before they could argue further, wielding the sword she'd held when she returned from the past. It was a wicked piece of steel coated in tatanite, capable of cleaving through metal and stone alike. She was gone in the blink of an eye, the nights parting for her like the Red Sea. Kevin took Gwen's hand.
Let's go help your idiot cousin.
Gwen pulled him into a kiss. You have no idea how much I love you. They raced off together out into the fight. Jen wasn't sure what she'd find when she reached the cave. The fallen Forever Knights weren't a shock. Finding Conduit Edwards run through was less than pleasant, but she kept moving. She did stop to check the pulse on Squire Winston. She closed her eyes for a second, finding no sign of life in the boy. He had to have been a few months younger than her. She moved on, catching up with George, who nodded to her as she whirled her sword. The slimy, glowing Vilgax was a bit of a surprise. She'd sort of assumed that the Dagon would have killed or consumed him. He laughed when he spotted her.
Ah, my greatest enemy. It is so fitting that you will be here in my greatest moment of triumph.
You really think we're going to let you win? Even if you've decided to bow to the Dagon, I can and will still beat you, just like I always have. Vilgax laughed loudly.
You understand nothing, child. This fight is already over.
The wall around the seal began to crumble, but instead of the cave simply collapsing in on all three of them, the rocks fell to reveal a swirling minty green sky. A temple, tall as the Empire State Building, rested under that sky. Though there seemed to be no life there, the seal was all that stood in the way of the world beyond. A rumble crashed across the battlefield, and Kevin snatched up a fallen weapon from one of the knights. It was a surprisingly green blaster. He frowned, pulling his badge out of his pocket and clicking it into place on the blaster. All functions now available. He grinned.
Forever Knights have been raiding plumber tech.
A resounding crash echoed around the battlefield, and the knights scattered away from the entrance to the cave. Gwen glanced at Kevin, true fear in her eyes. He grabbed her hand.
We can do this.
She nodded, and they took off at a run to the cave. When they got there, past several dozen fallen Esoterica and Forever Knights, there was a scene to behold. A battle raged between Vilgax, who looked like he had been fused with a Lacubra, and Jen fighting alongside George. The seal was glowing a sickly yellow. Jen was throwing fireballs at Vilgax. Kevin shook his head.
I thought Vilgax was dead,
he called out. Jen shook her head. Which time? She seemed resigned to their presence here, knowing there was nothing she could truly do to prevent them from fighting at her side.
My master grows ever closer.
Vilgax laughed, stepping through the fire.
Your world will be his.
Gwen threw up a shield around them, which was lucky. A wave of light came from the seal. It sounded as though something was beating against it. But the light washed over the mana shield and out of the cave. Vilgax laughed riotously.
You are too late. Every living being on your world has become a servant of my master, an esoterica.
Jen glanced at Gwen for confirmation, and Gwen's eyes flashed pink. She shook her head in disbelief. He's not lying. I can't sense billions of lives that should be there. Some of the knights are still out there, but not all of them. It seemed that Charmcaster's theory was correct. The iron in their helmets had saved them. Gwen's own mana shield had stopped the transformation for them. Jen's hands shook with rage, and she glared daggers at Vilgax.
See the true power of the Dagon!
He cried out as he attacked shattering Gwen's shield. Jen and George wasted no time in attacking. Jen called back to the other two. Gwen, reseal him. Kevin, help her. We've got Vilgax. They nodded, racing away from the fight to regroup. George and Jen had fought together for 6 months. He had taught her everything she knew about swordplay, and she'd showed him that improvisation had a place in war. He'd been regimented in his training, inflexible in his ways, but no more. He'd been practicing over his long life. A solid hit from Edel's blast sent Vilgax hurtling through the line between worlds, and George and Jen followed him. The air on this side of the line was colder, stiller, almost dusty, as if it had been a very long time since anything living had walked on this world. It was very unsettling, to say the least.
What is happening? Slave, speak to me.
The voice of the Dagon rumbled from the seal.
Your servant speaks no more, foul beast.
A rumble caught their attention as the building Jen had thrown Vilgax through lifted off its foundations.
I speak for my master, and that makes me more powerful than I have ever been.
He threw the building, and Jen transformed back into herself, grabbing George and throwing them both to the ground. She shouted something as the building came crashing down on top of them. But when the rumbling stopped, both of them were buried under the rubble. Vilgax laughed.
Silenced at last, child! Enough of your vendetta, slave. Free me!
Vilgax grinned.
Consider it done, master.